Okay, great. So, good morning, Jim. Jim's over in Sydney. Good afternoon to everybody else who's here. I'm T.L. Hill, the Managing Director of Fox Management Consulting and Professor of Strategy here at Temple, and I'm really looking forward to this interview with James Hutchin, who's the President and Founder of Alba Advisors. He's also the Senior Research Associate here at the Fox School. And as an insurance executive and advisor, he's lived through and helped clients and companies manage their way through quite a number of pretty challenging external shocks, everything from earthquakes to 9/11, peso crisis, global financial crisis. And today he's going to talk about shock and awe, and how that shock and awe of a crisis can sometimes turn into resilience and sometimes innovation. So Jim, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career? How did you get into insurance?
Sure. Well, insurance at the time was sort of the perfect refuge for the liberal arts major. So I had a degree in philosophy and Asian studies, and then a graduate degree in business. And I was looking at some place where I could combine that. And the practice you get with dealing with theoretical frameworks in the world of philosophy, thinking through things, understanding history, because that does give you a predictive base for some things. As an example of that, I think everybody dealing with the pandemic now ought to pick up Google and find out everything they can about the Great Lisbon earthquake, because back in the 1600s, it changed the world in much the same way that this pandemic will change us. So it really came down to—
changing the world in some sort of structural way, or
yeah, it changed it in a structural way. It kicked off the Age of Enlightenment in part because the earthquake took place on a Sunday morning in Lisbon when the churches were full, and it had everybody really questioning their view of their world, their Weltanschauung, as the Germans might say, because they said, well, wait a second, how does a rational God unleash this sort of thing on us? So that sort of background combined with the numeric skills you pick up in an MBA degree, you know, TL, long story made short, risk is fascinating. Insurance often is not. And I prefer to think of it as the risk industry, not really the insurance industry.
Well,
and so you can
sort
take
of
it and apply
a nice
it to elsewhere.
segue, because I was going to say that part of the insurance industry is accepting other people's risk in a lot of ways, or thinking about how to manage that, and also uncertainty. And so how did you learn to think about risk and uncertainty in the world of risk backed up by insurance?
A number of thoughts. You're really going through a process, but you're trying to determine what sort of risk it is. Now, is this a highly predictable risk, like life insurance? You know, if you give me—
it doesn't feel predictable to us, that life insurance.
It doesn't feel predictable now, and we'll get to that. That's going to be one of the shocks. But if you take a look at a population of 1 million people, actuaries can get in there and predict how many people are going to die over the next 20 years very accurately, within 1 or 2 percentage points. They can't tell you who. The old joke is, unless they're a mafia actuary.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is other types of loss are really much more catastrophic in nature, unpredictable. I'm sure many of your readers or the viewers here have read The Black Swan, Nassim Taleb's work on what we term as extremely low frequency and extremely high severity events. That's the sort of event we're living through now. And those types of risks are marked by the level of uncertainty, the lack of experience one has in dealing with them, and the fact that they tend to move very fast on you and in unpredictable ways.
So building on that, I mean, you've helped companies navigate 9/11, the global financial crisis. I think that there's at least two that people may have thought about, but kind of theoretically. They certainly weren't predicted. They were a surprise, and they unfolded in very unusual ways. I mean, I remember talking to someone after 9/11 who said, you know, we had really thought about it. We had planned. You know, we're in the World Trade Center. We have 3 different providers providing 3 different phone services in case, you know, something went down. It turns out they were all subcontracted to one provider. There was one line, it got cut, and all of a sudden, you know, half the trades of bonds around the world were at risk, and they had to literally run a new wire. I mean, how do you navigate something like this and come out reasonably intact?
Well, let me, I'm going to answer it in a couple parts. And comparing 9/11 with the GFC might be where I start.
Mm,
I like to use what is at this moment an unfortunate metaphor, and that is a disease metaphor.
mm,
So some types of risk are chronic in
mhm,
nature. It's like a chronic disease, and even though they may appear at once, they were always there. So a good example of that would be what I might call self-inflicted heart disease. You've been eating at, you know, max every day, and you're drinking too much, and you're smoking, and you wake up one day with a heart attack. Then that really is a chronic disease issue manifesting itself in an acute episode. Now you break your leg, that's just an acute episode. 9/11 was an acute injury. It was rapid. It was clearly an externality. It was not self-inflicted. The GFC was different. That thing
mm,
had been cooking along for quite a while with really irresponsible, some would say fraudulent financial structures taking
mhm,
over Wall Street. And it manifested itself in the GFC, which felt very acute, but fixing that sort of problem typically takes longer.
mm,
So, you know, when you're in the midst of it, um, it's really hard to look at it rationally. When you look at it in advance, and maybe we can use the pandemic as an example, in 2006, and I know that sounds like ages ago, but it hasn't changed that much. Um, I was at the Harvard School of Public Health, and we were war gaming how a pandemic would develop.
mm,
And at that time, the concern was the bird flu.
mm,
Um, what I can tell you is the timeline that, at least in our breakout group that we worked out, is playing out with all the same events taking place that we'd predicted.
mm.
And people way smarter than I had developed the plans, the contingency plans, and what we call scenario and threats, sort of war gaming in advance, so that they would be ready for something like this.
So that's really interesting to me. So there seems to be, I'm hearing two things. One is something like the global financial crisis, because it in some sense was structural and it chronic, building over time, was something that at least in theory could be predicted, and you could plan for it if you're a sort of well-managed company. On the one hand, on the back end, it takes a while to, like a long time, 10 years to rebuild. For the more acute stuff, it's harder to plan for, but you can what if for, you can do scenario planning for, and have
Yes,
maybe the comfort of a quicker bounce back.
you can have the comfort. Um, Let me rephrase that. You can have less discomfort because
Mm,
it's really hard living through
yeah,
something like this.
yeah.
And that's something that, excuse me, I don't think people necessarily spend enough time on it. And that is the human element
Mm,
in crisis response.
mm-hmm,
But you can have less discomfort if at the very least you say, okay, we've played out that scenario. Now,
mm-hmm,
every company in the world now, every listed public company uh, now has a board that is a crisis, that has a crisis response committee, a risk management committee. That wasn't true before 9/11. So
mm,
that's one of the ways in which 9/11 fundamentally changed the world, is people are reaching for the red book or the file on the computer. They've war gamed this and they're thinking about how they respond.
mm,
And that's important because um, as, as Napoleon said once, no battle plan actually survives its first meeting with the enemy.
mm-hmm,
But if you don't have it in hand, you don't know how you need to pivot and adjust it.
right.
So you can reduce the uncertainty. You can, phrase I tend to use is, you know, sort of narrow the bookends of your uncertainty if you've done some pre-planning.
Yeah. So having thought about it, back at Harvard in 2006, and just your general experience, this is a little bit risky, but how do you see things playing out over the next few months, and how might executives navigate this?
Um, so, you know, I've been thinking about that. I've been asked that by a couple people, and TL, you know me well enough to know that I'm the perennial optimist
Yeah.
and really tend to be. But in many ways, this is the hardest sort of crisis to deal with. And it's the hardest sort of crisis to deal with because, first, it is truly an externality.
Mm,
Nobody can say they were responsible for the crisis initiation. Um, people, and when I say politically, just to be clear, I don't mean just politics at a national level, but the politics that are inside large corporations, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Politically, that can make something like this easier to deal with because there's no one to blame.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other things that start to factor in, and these crises, although they all differ in terms of origination, there's a similar trajectory that they play out. And the first is shock and awe, where you're saying, "Oh my God, what's happening?" The second is acceptance of a new reality. All right, we're here, we're in it. And then it's about the third, response, when really meaningful response happens once people have accepted that reality, and then you're moving on to adaptation. This is a harder one to move through for a variety of reasons. It's an invisible enemy. I can't be Churchill and rally everybody around the bombing attacks. I can't be George Bush. There was that seminal moment in 9/11 when he stood on top of a heap of rubble that used to be the World Trade Building. And at that moment, he immediately moved us out of shock and awe into, okay, it really is a new reality. That building did come down. So
we were talking about that, just the difference in Australia to Pennsylvania, and even we're working with clients in Michigan. So like, you can see different parts of shock and awe and acceptance, where I would say by now where we are, we've been locked down for a while. People are acting in new ways. There's the beginnings of acceptance. We're sort of talking to a colleague in Michigan just a couple of days ago, and people are still out on the beach, essentially. It's spring break, and you were saying something similar is happening in Australia. Just had to close Bondi Beach because everyone was playing.
Yeah, we had 20,000 people on the beach, packed shoulder to shoulder, having a great party. I guess they were celebrating the term I've heard coming out of the U.S. is boomer remover.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Yeah, so you go through this trajectory, and the difficulty of this one is you have people that study this for a living, and they know the train is coming down the track, and they're shouting, and you can see the desperation in their voices sometimes as they're trying to navigate political systems, and let's face it, power structures that may be new to them, that they haven't been involved in. You don't become an epidemiologist because you love the idea of standing up in front of Congress and telling them what they need to do. So you have all these really desperately bright and brilliant people whose interpersonal skill set may or may not fit the situation required or the situational needs to deal with getting people really fired up. From this conference, we had a really interesting speaker, and this is going to be something grim to say, so my apologies in advance. He made the point that on any epidemic in the early going, we already have the vaccine. And the vaccine that we have is really the aggregated behaviors of the population if we can just get them right quickly. And somebody said, well, how do you do that? When do people really start responding? He said, well, generally, they only respond when nearly everybody knows someone that has died.
That's wonderful. No.
Sorry.
That's right. No, because I'm also a bit of an optimist and don't like to have my bubbles punctured. So one piece of advice. I mean, if you're a business leader right now and you're trying to, help not just your company, but your larger ecosystem or context kind of shift into acceptance and maybe begin to look past that to how you're going to come out of this, how you're going to respond. What do you do?
TL, I'm going to, if I might, I'm going to ask you not to mute me because I'm going to give 3.
Okay.
And I really, I think it's,
go ahead.
I think these are the 3 things to think about in a crisis. First is able leadership is absolutely critical. And I use an acronym, the 4 C's. You've got to have great competency. You have to know your industry better than anybody else. You have to know your people. And so the first C is competency. The second is collaboration. And the reason for the collaboration is to manage a crisis, you need more competencies than are ever going to be resident in a single human being. So you need to be able to reach out to that and create that team that gives you the skill sets you need, even if it means reaching out to companies outside of your own.
Yeah.
During the response to 9/11, there were any number of examples of that. The insurance industry was bringing in film and script writers that had done sci-fi films of terrorist attacks just to get better insight in terms of what might happen.
We were just talking to somebody in the event industry, and they're having daily meetings across the sort of event industry to try to figure out, what's going on with music in the future, right? So
yeah, it's all going to change. The third C is compassion.
Yeah.
And compassion sometimes expresses itself in odd ways. And if you're doing the hard things that you have to do, like lay off people, you can take less discomfort, I'll put it that way, in knowing that you're being compassionate to the 50% of staff whose job you were able to save. And the fourth is character. During a crisis, absolute, unmitigated, unfiltered truth-telling is what works best. Andrew Cuomo is probably a good example of that.
Yeah.
The second point I would make is we always talk about situational leadership styles. This is the time for command and control. I know it's not popular in the 21st century, but by way of example, if we were doing this session in a room and the loudspeaker came on and said, there's a bomb in the building, we need you to exit, some people would much rather be told, here's what you do next, rather than have me stand up or have you stand up and say, well, how do we form a consensus around this?
Yeah.
So leadership needs
command
to be
control works in
situational.
short bursts, and now is a short burst. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it gives people oddly comfort because, all right, now somebody's telling me what to do. And believe it or not, having been through this a number of times, they forgive you when you make the mistake that it's inevitable that you'll make.
Yeah.
And the third is move fast to assure your survival. And you move fast because if you're going to reduce expenses, if I reduce them today, I'm probably not going to see the impact for a month. Meanwhile, that crisis is continuing to move to me, move on me. Last comment.
So leadership, command and control, move fast, and now your concluding comment?
My concluding comment, some reading for people or some things to take a look at if they're interested besides the Great Lisbon earthquake, and I'm dead serious, that's one worth reviewing, would be, even though it's ancient history at this point, James Burke, who was CEO of Johnson & Johnson when the Tylenol poisonings took place. They were my client at the time. Some remarkable stories to share from that. I won't do it at the moment. The other would be Ben Bernanke during the GFC. My God, did we get lucky? And my God, is he a demonstration of competency? He had done his PhD theory on the Great Depression and the situations leading up to it, and didn't hesitate to act. He moved fast. He demonstrated the four C's that I talked about. And the third is, if you want a contemporary one, look at Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas. Remarkable leader. Qantas will be one of the survivors in an industry where there will be few.
Great. Thanks. Thank you so much.